There is a supplement that has gone from a niche item found only in specialty herbal shops to one of the most studied and most widely used natural compounds on the market today. Ashwagandha. And unlike a lot of trending supplements that ride a wave of social media hype before the science catches up or fails to support the claims, ashwagandha has been the subject of a genuinely substantial and growing body of clinical research over the past 2 decades. Randomized controlled trials, systematic reviews, meta-analyses pooling data across thousands of participants. This is not a supplement riding on tradition alone, although it does have a very long history of traditional use. It is increasingly backed by modern evidence covering stress, sleep, hormone levels, physical performance, cognitive function, and more. But here is the problem. Most of what circulates online about ashwagandha is either wildly overstated, treating it like a miracle cure for everything, or dismissively wrong, treating it as nothing more than herbal folklore with no real evidence behind it. The truth, as is so often the case, sits in a more interesting and more useful place in between. In this video, we are going to go through what ashwagandha actually is, the mechanisms behind how it works in the body, what the strongest research specifically shows it can and cannot do, the right way to take it, and who should be cautious about using it. By the end, you will have a clear and evidence-based understanding of whether this is a supplement worth adding to your own routine. Part 1. What ashwagandha actually is. Ashwagandha, scientifically known as Withania somnifera, is a small shrub native to India, the Middle East, and parts of Africa, where its root and sometimes its berries have been used in traditional Ayurvedic medicine for thousands of years. The name itself is often translated to mean something close to the smell of a horse, which traditionally referred to the belief that consuming it would impart the strength and vitality of a horse. Whether or not that folk explanation holds up, the modern research has focused heavily on a different and more precisely defined category of effects, namely, the plant's impact on the body's stress response system. The active compounds responsible for most of ashwagandha's effects are a group of steroidal lactones called withanolides. Withanolides are the primary focus of most modern research, and most standardized ashwagandha extracts are measured and marketed based on their withanolide concentration because this is considered the most reliable indicator of potency and consistency from one product to another. Ashwagandha belongs to a category of herbs that researchers call adaptogens. An adaptogen, broadly speaking, is a substance believed to help the body adapt to and resist various forms of physical, chemical, and biological stress, working to support and normalize bodily functions rather than pushing any single system in one specific direction. This is a meaningfully different concept from a stimulant, which pushes the nervous system in one direction, or a sedative, which pushes it in another. The adaptogen framework suggests a more balancing or modulating effect, and much of the modern research on ashwagandha has focused specifically on testing whether this traditional concept holds up under rigorous scientific scrutiny. Part 2. The mechanism. How ashwagandha actually works in the body. To understand why ashwagandha has the effects the research describes, you need to understand its primary mechanism of action, which centers on something called the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, commonly abbreviated as the HPA axis. The HPA axis is the body's central stress response system. When you encounter a stressor, whether that is a genuine physical threat, a stressful conversation, a work deadline, or chronic ongoing pressure in your life, your hypothalamus, a small region at the base of your brain, signals your pituitary gland, which in turn signals your adrenal glands to release cortisol. Cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone, and in short bursts, it is enormously useful, helping mobilize energy, sharpen focus, and prepare the body to respond to a challenge. The problem arises when this system is activated too frequently or too persistently, which is an accurate description of how most adults in the modern world live. Chronically elevated cortisol is associated with a long list of negative health outcomes, including impaired sleep, increased abdominal fat storage, suppressed immune function, elevated blood sugar, and a heightened baseline state of anxiety and tension that makes everyday stressors feel more overwhelming than they otherwise would. This is where ashwagandha's primary documented mechanism comes in. Multiple studies have shown that ashwagandha supplementation reduces serum cortisol levels in people experiencing chronic stress. The withanolides in ashwagandha appear to help regulate the HPA axis, essentially helping to turn down an overactive stress response system rather than suppressing cortisol entirely, which would be neither healthy nor desirable. The goal of a well-functioning stress response system is appropriate activation and appropriate recovery. And the evidence suggests ashwagandha supports that balance rather than blunting the system altogether. Beyond the HPA axis, ashwagandha has also been studied for its effects on several neurotransmitter systems in the brain, including gamma-aminobutyric acid, commonly known as GABA, which is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter responsible for promoting calm and reducing neural excitability. Some research suggests ashwagandha may enhance GABA signaling, which would help explain some of its documented effects on anxiety and sleep quality. With this mechanistic foundation in place, let us go through what the actual clinical research shows across the specific areas where ashwagandha has been most extensively studied. Part 3. Stress and anxiety, the strongest evidence base. This is the area where ashwagandha has the most robust and most consistent body of clinical evidence behind it, and it represents the supplement's primary and best supported use case. A frequently cited randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study examined the effects of high-concentration ashwagandha root extract on stressed adults over a 60-day period. The results were striking. Participants taking ashwagandha showed significantly greater reductions in serum cortisol levels compared to the placebo group. They also showed significant improvements on standardized stress assessment scales and reported improvements in general well-being and quality of life compared to those taking placebo. A systematic review and meta-analysis pooling data from multiple randomized controlled trials specifically evaluating ashwagandha's effects on stress and anxiety found that ashwagandha supplementation was associated with significant reductions in self-reported stress and anxiety scores compared to placebo, with effect sizes that were considered clinically meaningful rather than merely statistically significant. What makes this body of evidence particularly compelling is the consistency across different study populations, different dosing protocols, and different standardized extracts. While the exact magnitude of benefit varies somewhat between individual studies, the overall direction of the evidence is remarkably consistent. Ashwagandha reduces cortisol and reduces subjective measures of stress and anxiety in the population studied, which were generally adults experiencing moderate, chronic, everyday stress rather than people with diagnosed clinical anxiety disorders. It is worth being precise about this distinction. The research supports ashwagandha as a tool for managing the kind of everyday chronic stress that affects most adults, particularly in demanding careers or high-pressure life circumstances. It is not positioned in the research as a replacement for clinical treatment of diagnosed anxiety disorders, depression, or other mental health conditions. And anyone dealing with those conditions should be working with an appropriate healthcare provider rather than relying on a supplement alone. Part 4. Sleep quality. Given ashwagandha's effects on cortisol and the stress response system, it makes biological sense that it would also influence sleep, since chronically elevated cortisol is one of the most well-established disruptors of healthy sleep architecture. The research on this specific application has grown substantially in recent years. A systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, specifically evaluating ashwagandha's effects on sleep, found that ashwagandha supplementation produced a small but statistically significant improvement in overall sleep quality compared to placebo. The effect was more pronounced in two specific subgroups: people who were specifically diagnosed with insomnia, and people taking higher doses of ashwagandha, generally above 600 milligrams per day, for at least 8 weeks. The improvements observed in the research included reduced time to fall asleep, improved overall sleep quality scores, and in some studies, improved total sleep time. The mechanism is believed to be related to ashwagandha's effects on cortisol regulation and its potential influence on GABA signaling, both of which are directly relevant to the body's ability to transition into and maintain restful sleep. It is worth noting that the sleep benefits documented in the research tend to be more modest than the stress and anxiety benefits, and the effect appears most reliable in people who have an identifiable sleep problem to begin with, rather than producing dramatic improvements in people who already sleep reasonably well. This is a common and expected pattern in supplement research generally, where the people who have the most room for improvement tend to show the largest measurable effects. Part 5. Testosterone and Male Reproductive Health. This is one of the most frequently discussed applications of ashwagandha, particularly in fitness and men's health spaces, and the research here, while promising, deserves a careful and precise summary, rather than the often inflated claims you may have encountered elsewhere. Several randomized controlled trials have examined ashwagandha's effects on testosterone levels and related markers of male reproductive health. A number of these studies, particularly those conducted in men experiencing infertility or those engaged in resistance training programs, have found statistically significant increases in serum testosterone levels following ashwagandha supplementation compared to placebo, generally over study periods ranging from 8 to 12 weeks. One frequently referenced study involving men engaged in a resistance training program found that those supplementing with ashwagandha showed significantly greater increases in testosterone levels and significantly greater improvements in muscle strength and muscle mass compared to those in the placebo group following the same training program. Other studies examining men with fertility concerns have found that ashwagandha supplementation was associated with improvements in sperm count, sperm motility, and semen volume compared to placebo, alongside the testosterone increases observed. The mechanism behind these effects is believed to relate back to ashwagandha's primary action on cortisol. Cortisol and testosterone have a well-documented inverse relationship in the body, sometimes described in research as a hormonal seesaw, where chronically elevated cortisol tends to suppress testosterone production. By reducing cortisol, ashwagandha may be removing a suppressive brake on testosterone production rather than directly stimulating testosterone synthesis through some entirely separate pathway. This distinction matters because it suggests the testosterone benefits documented in the research are likely to be most pronounced in men who have elevated stress levels or elevated baseline cortisol to begin with, rather than representing a universal testosterone-boosting effect regardless of someone's starting hormonal or stress profile. The honest summary here is that the existing research is genuinely promising and consistent enough to take seriously, but it remains an area where more large-scale, long-term research would help clarify exactly which populations see the most benefit and what the upper limits of the effect actually are. Part 6. Physical Performance and Muscle Strength. Beyond the testosterone-specific research, several studies have looked more broadly at ashwagandha's effects on physical performance, including strength, muscle recovery, and cardiorespiratory endurance. A systematic review examining multiple randomized controlled trials on ashwagandha and exercise performance found consistent evidence that ashwagandha supplementation was associated with significant improvements in muscle strength and muscle size when combined with resistance training compared to resistance training alone with a placebo. Several of these studies also found improvements in markers of exercise-induced muscle damage and faster recovery between training sessions, suggesting ashwagandha may have a meaningful anti-inflammatory or recovery-supporting effect in the context of physical training. There is also research specifically examining cardiorespiratory endurance, with several studies finding that ashwagandha supplementation improved maximal oxygen consumption, commonly referred to as VO2 max, in both athletes and non-athletic adults compared to placebo. VO2 max is widely considered one of the most important indicators of cardiovascular fitness and is strongly associated with overall longevity and reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, which makes this particular line of research noteworthy beyond just athletic performance. The practical implication of this body of research is that ashwagandha appears to offer a meaningful complementary benefit for people who are already engaged in a structured resistance training or cardiovascular exercise program, rather than functioning as a substitute for that training. The supplement appears to amplify the benefits of exercise rather than replicating them independently. Part 7. Cognitive Function and Memory. The research on ashwagandha and cognitive function is a newer and somewhat smaller body of evidence compared to the stress, sleep, and hormonal research, but the existing studies show a promising and biologically coherent pattern. A randomized controlled trial examining adults with mild cognitive impairment found that those taking ashwagandha root extract over an 8-week period showed significant improvements in several measures of cognitive function compared to placebo, including immediate and general memory, executive function, attention, and information processing speed. The proposed mechanisms behind these cognitive effects include ashwagandha's antioxidant properties, which may help protect neurons from oxidative stress, along with its established effects on reducing cortisol, since chronically elevated cortisol is independently associated with impaired memory formation and accelerated cognitive decline over time. There is also some preliminary research suggesting ashwagandha may support the growth and maintenance of dendrites, the branching extensions of neurons that are critical for communication between brain cells, although this research is still in relatively early stages compared to the human clinical data on stress and cortisol. The cognitive research, while promising, is the least mature of all the areas discussed in this video, and it would benefit considerably from larger and longer duration studies before any strong conclusions can be drawn about ashwagandha as a dedicated cognitive enhancement tool. It is reasonable to view potential cognitive benefits as a possible secondary effect that may accompany ashwagandha's better established benefits on stress and sleep, rather than as a primary reason to take the supplement on its own. Part 8. How to take it, dosing, and form. If you're considering adding ashwagandha to your routine based on the evidence discussed in this video, getting the dose and form right matters significantly because not all ashwagandha products on the market are created equal. Most of the clinical research demonstrating meaningful benefits has used standardized root extracts, generally containing somewhere between 5 and 10% withanolide content, which is the specific class of active compounds discussed earlier in this video. When shopping for an ashwagandha supplement, look specifically for the withanolide percentage listed on the label. Products that fail to disclose this percentage are difficult to evaluate against the research, since the actual potency can vary enormously between products even when the total milligram amount of ashwagandha root or extract listed on the label looks similar. Two of the most extensively studied standardized extracts in the clinical research are sold under the trade names K, SM66, and Sensoril. These specific extracts have each been used in multiple peer-reviewed clinical trials, which means choosing a product containing one of these standardized extracts gives you a reasonable degree of confidence that you are taking something similar to what was actually studied, rather than a generic extract of unknown potency and composition. Dosing across the research varies somewhat depending on the specific outcome being studied, but a commonly used and well-supported range across the stress, anxiety, and sleep research falls between 300 and 600 milligrams per day of a standardized extract, typically divided into 1 or 2 doses. Some of the studies focused specifically on testosterone and physical performance used doses up to 600 milligrams per day as well. Most of the clinical trials demonstrating measurable benefits ran for a minimum of 8 weeks, which suggests that ashwagandha is not generally a fast-acting supplement with immediate effects, but rather something that produces its most reliable benefits with consistent use over a period of 2 months or longer. Part 9. Who should be cautious? While ashwagandha has a generally favorable safety profile in the research, particularly compared to many pharmaceutical interventions for stress and anxiety, there are several specific populations and situations where caution is warranted, and this is worth taking seriously. Ashwagandha can have effects on thyroid hormone levels, with some research suggesting it may increase levels of thyroid hormones in certain individuals. People with hyperthyroidism or any condition involving excess thyroid hormone production should approach ashwagandha with particular caution and should not begin supplementing without first discussing it with their doctor, since the supplement could potentially worsen an already overactive thyroid. Ashwagandha belongs to the nightshade family of plants, and people with autoimmune conditions, particularly conditions affecting the thyroid such as Hashimoto's disease or other autoimmune disorders, should discuss ashwagandha with their doctor before use, since some research suggests it may stimulate immune system activity in ways that could theoretically be unfavorable for certain autoimmune conditions, even though it shows benefit for general stress-related outcomes in the broader population. Because of its documented effects on hormone levels, women who are pregnant or breastfeeding should avoid ashwagandha, as there is insufficient safety data in these populations and some traditional and preliminary evidence suggesting it may not be appropriate during pregnancy specifically. Ashwagandha may also interact with certain medications, including sedatives, thyroid medications, and medications that suppress the immune system. If you are taking any prescription medications, particularly in these categories, discussing ashwagandha with your doctor or pharmacist before starting is a sensible precaution, rather than an overreaction. And finally, while ashwagandha's safety profile is generally favorable in the research, there have been a small number of case reports describing liver-related concerns associated with ashwagandha use, which has prompted some additional scrutiny of the supplement in recent years. This remains a rare and not yet fully understood signal in the research, rather than an established widespread risk, but it is a reasonable additional reason to source ashwagandha from reputable manufacturers to avoid significantly exceeding studied dosing ranges, and to discuss starting any new supplement with your doctor, particularly if you have any pre-existing liver condition. The bottom line: ashwagandha represents one of the more genuinely well-supported categories of adaptogenic supplements available today, with a clinical research base that has grown substantially over the past 2 decades and continues to expand. The strongest and most consistent evidence supports its use for reducing cortisol and managing everyday chronic stress and anxiety. The evidence for sleep quality improvement is solid, particularly for people with existing sleep difficulties. The research on testosterone, physical performance, and cognitive function is promising and biologically coherent, though somewhat less extensive than the stress-related research, and likely most relevant for people with elevated baseline stress or cortisol levels to begin with. If you decide this is worth trying, look for a standardized extract with a clearly listed with analyte percentage, ideally one of the well-studied trade name extracts, dosed in the 300 to 600 milligram range, and give it a genuine 8-week trial before evaluating whether it is making a meaningful difference for you specifically. And if you fall into any of the cautionary categories discussed, particularly thyroid conditions, autoimmune conditions, pregnancy, or you are taking relevant medications, have that conversation with your doctor first. Like most things in nutrition and supplementation, ashwagandha is not a miracle, and it is not snake oil. It is a genuinely studied compound with a specific and well-understood mechanism, real benefits supported by real research, and real limitations and precautions that deserve to be taken seriously alongside the benefits. Stay consistent, and we will see you in the next one.